Will try to get it up top. They'll go deep, wide open is Stills, and no one near him for a Houston touchdown on the opening drive. Chief offense, 3 and out. Colquitt is blocked, and it's picked up by the Texans to run it in for the touchdown. It's Lonnie Johnson with the recovery up the ramp. He goes.
Puts him back there when it's important.
Big hang time. Ball is fumbled by Hill. Oh, it's going to be Houston football.
Okay, we're going to stick with this play. We're good. We like it.
Out of the gun on 2nd and goal. Across the middle, and it's caught by Finger on the hole. And the kick is 39-48. Just 12 seconds shy of a 40-minute domination. And a return come in. It's Hardman. Johnson has an angle on him. Did he step out? They don't say stepped out. He takes it another 20 yards. Now a guy has caught on the run for the touchdown. Damian Williams. And they fake it. They snap it to Reed, and he is stopped by Sorensen. Flings it. Caught. Touchdown, Kelsey.
Somebody else beat you on this team.
Mahomes going to slide to the right. Gets away from J.J. Watt inside the 10. And now the bounds at the 5 a second. See, will wing off the right side. Now moves to the left. Here's Mahomes. Looking. Open field for a moment. He may have been past the line of scrimmage. It's called a touchdown. I tell you, this is going to be close, Gene Sterrett. Williams drives it in for the touchdown. Sits out this one. 1st and goal, Williams. He's in. 6 for 6. Mahomes with a touchdown pass to Blake Bell. He didn't have one all season, but he's got one in the divisional round.
Never puts right in the sky.
And here he comes. Here comes Clark. Clark gets him all the way back at the 25. He's down.
A self-destruction for the ages. This divisional round matchup for the Houston Texans was one that has so much on the line for the team and franchise. To utterly rout one of the best teams in football with a 24-0 lead early in the first half, especially with the Patrick Mahomes-led team, and it would lead to a grudge match in the AFC Championship game with their biggest rival and potentially a Super Bowl berth. This would be the victory that would finally get the Texans to their highest point since they came to the league nearly 20 years ago from when they were inducted into the league. All they had to do now was hold on to the lead. But they blew it. In 10 minutes. A combination of a collapsing defense, stagnant offense, and awful play calling on both sides of the ball led to this spectacular choke that rivals 35-3, and its effects were just as disastrous. The team couldn't afford to lose. What happened the next year would only echo the disappointment and failure that came from this loss. There's a lot more to this story than just this one game and its aftermath. For there is 60 years of history around Houston football in the NFL. A lot of it is full of disappointments and failure on par with it, and it has all combined and left the city and its fan base devoid of all hope for the short-term future. But of all the recent failures, it all spanned from one year in particular, 8 years ago. The name Houston is one of legend to the residents of Texas. It was named for Sam Houston, a native Virginian, honorary Cherokee, and former governor for the state of Tennessee who left for Texas in 1832, around the same time that tensions between the Texian settlers and Mexican government arose. Key to the push to make Texas independent, he also defeated Santa Anna's army in a rout at the Battle of San Jacinto in just 18 minutes. Houston would also serve as the first president of the state of Texas's home, as it was named the capital. He would serve as senator of the state of Texas after it was annexed in 1845. He was also elected governor just as tensions around slavery were about to erupt, and was removed from his post after refusing to sign the Oath of the Confederacy, and he would die later at his home in Huntsville as the Civil War raged on. This man cared about Texas, which is why the biggest city in Texas and the Deep South bears his name. After his death, his name became synonymous with the Texas oil industry, something which helped make Houston such a big place for economics, and the space race, as the NASA Space Center in Houston was key in securing America's most important victory of the Cold War and the development of the space shuttle. The name will forever be tied to history, but lately the city isn't as much known for those things. Nothing much more other than hurricanes and bad sports teams. Houston area is home to 3 sports franchises among the top in the nation: the Houston Astros in the MLB, Houston Rockets in the NBA, and the Houston Texans in the NFL. Each of these teams have had struggles and are entering struggles not seen in years. The Astros did win a title in 2017 after Hurricane Harvey wrecked the area, and it was testament to how the management of the Astros turned a really bad team into a really good one, only for the team to be exposed 2 years later with that title being revealed to have been won by massive cheating, the most notorious cheating scandal in baseball in almost 100 years. The Rockets spent the last few years with superstar talent like James Harden, Chris Paul, and a couple of others, with the potential to win a 3rd title for the organization, but were killed by that same superstar talent caring more for their own egos and stats than that of their team and teammates. Also something about China controlling the NBA's money and being hypocritical political actors. But how have the Texans fared? After all, they are the youngest professional sports team in the city. Well, they fared just like Houston normally fares in the NFL. This last season, the Houston Texans have gone just 4-12 for the second time in 4 years. Their new head coach has a resume of unprovenness. Their GM is a hire that Houston disgraced themselves previously to try to get. They've been losing key talents on offense and defense over the last few seasons. The owner and Bob McNair that brought the NFL back to Houston is dead. The franchise's best defensive player in J.J. Watt has just been released from the organization to join the team that we traded DeAndre Hopkins to. And the franchise quarterback in Deshaun Watson that Houston fought so hard to get has now demanded a trade due to a combination of franchise incompetence and political reasoning. And then set off a trap card of allegations of sexual impropriety, with over 20 women coming forward in civil court against the quarterback with very serious potential that this could go into criminal proceedings. This is the reality of the Houston Texans and quite honestly Houston sports in general. Chaos has loomed over the city for years in terms of championship teams in different leagues and sports. Houston as a city hasn't gotten a legitimate championship of their own since the Rockets repeated it in the 90s. While they had a good stretch of time in this millennium where they were near the cusp of glory, things would always turn sour. But Houston in the National Football League is a much sadder story to tell. They actually had a different team in the NFL after the 1970 AFL-NFL merger, but were taken away by greed. And at the start of the last decade, the Texans were finally actually putting together the pieces for a playoff run and potentially a future championship run. They were led by 3 studs on offense and 1 on defense. Quarterback Matt Schaub, who was brought in to replace failed number 1 overall draft pick David Carr in 2007 and had been playing at just below elite level of play. Andre Johnson, one of the best wide receivers in NFL history and the most beloved player in Texans history. Arian Foster, an undrafted running back who burst onto the scene to be one of the best in the league at the time. And J.J. Watt, who needs no introduction. Just as they were getting closer and closer to that sweet, sweet glory of the playoffs and a Super Bowl, they were beat down in the most brutal way imaginable in the 2013 NFL season. Houston would never be the same again. Why it happened is up for debate, but before we discuss what caused them to collapse, I want to go through that fateful season to show just how this team went from perhaps the best expansion NFL team ever to having the worst collapse in NFL history, and how it led the city of Houston down a path that would be towards its lowest point in the NFL since the Oilers moved out of the city, and how it may lead to a horrible future.
Houston has the Oilers, the greatest football team. We take the ball from goal to goal like no one's ever seen. We're in the air, we're on the ground, always in control. And when you say the Oilers, you're talking Super Bowl, 'cause we're the Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers #1. Yes, we're the Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers. Houston Oilers
To tell the story of the Houston Texans, we have to first go back to the days of the AFL, and with the team that used to be located in Houston, the Oilers. The team was founded by Houston oil magnate Bud Adams, who made it big with the Texas oil industry and, just like Sam Houston, was an honorary Cherokee. As one of the founders of the AFL, Adams made his living the namesake of his football franchise thanks to the Texas oil industry, and the Oilers played in the American Football League as one of its founding teams from 1960 to 1970 before joining the NFL as part of the AFL-NFL merger. During their 10-year run in the AFL, they would win the first 2 championships of league's existence, making 3 of them in a row, losing to the Dallas Texans, who would eventually become the Kansas City Chiefs, and 1 more later to the Oakland Raiders, which would be 4 appearances in the championship game, and won 4 division titles, going to the playoffs 5 times in that 10-year time span. And also in 1969, Bud Adams was also able to sublease the arena they would share with the MLB team in the area, the Houston Astros, in the Astrodome, the world's first domed stadium, and build the 8th wonder of the world. The Houston Oilers were one of the better teams of the AFL, tying the Buffalo Bills in second spot for total titles, with the Chiefs each winning 3 above them. And in the NFL, they would be looking to make a splash immediately, joining longtime stalwart Pittsburgh Steelers, Cleveland Browns, and Cincinnati Bengals in the AFC Central. But instead, they flopped out the gate. From 1971 to 1973, their first 3 seasons in the league, they were unable to not only get over 500, they didn't even win more than 4 games in any of those seasons. They were completely awful with a combined record of 8-32-1. For reference, Matt Patricia as a head coach of the Detroit Lions had a better 3-year run as a coach than Houston had as a team in a new league facing new teams. Well, to be fair, that was bound to happen, and that's even a recurring theme that exists today with some teams on the AFL side of the merger not amounting to much or being extremely cursed, like Minnesota. This was still not a good look for the Oilers. Luckily, though, in 1974, things improved as a Hall of Fame coach in Sid Gilman would be temporarily brought in to help whip the losing bunch into shape, and they went 7-7 that year. While 500 is much better than not winning double-digit total of games in their first 3 years of their time in the NFL, it still wasn't good enough to make anything noteworthy of that season or even get close to the playoffs. But in the next year, Houston made massive improvements, as under the guidance of new head coach and GM Bud Bum Phillips, and 2 stars in defensive end Elvin Bethea, wide receiver and return specialist Billy White Shoes Johnson, as well as QB Dan Pastorini, they went an astounding 10-4. While this obviously wasn't enough to make the playoffs back then, as this is in a time where 10-win teams could get knocked out more easily, this still marked the first winning season for the team in the 1970s, and was massively looking for better days ahead. While 76 and 77 weren't much better, as in the 1976 season the team went 5-9, and 1977 was marked with an 8-6 record, they would get a major shot in the arm thanks to Bum trading up to select the Texas Longhorn star running back and Texas native Earl Campbell, the Tyler Rose. The Oiler Cannonball, who would go on to break the rookie rushing record that season and led the league in rushing yards with 1,450 to help lead the Oilers to the playoffs for the first time in the NFL with a 10-6 record, and nearly went on to Super Bowl 13 as they beat the Bengals and Dolphins in the wild card and divisional rounds, before being beaten soundly by the eventual Super Bowl champions and division rivals Steelers in the AFC Championship game. This was an impressive turnaround for the organization, and they would go to the playoffs 3 straight times from 1978 to 1980, even making the AFC Championship game in the 1980 playoff round to get a shot at revenge against the Steelers, only to lose once again. But this would culminate in the greatest era, at least in the eyes of many, of Houston football. This was the Luv Ya Blue era. It was a short but wondrous time to be a fan of the Oilers. After each playoff loss, the fans would show up in force in a way that makes Arrowhead and the land of the 12s pale in comparison. The players, and even Bum Phillips himself, didn't even realize just how much the Oilers meant to the city of Houston, with their support and admiration of the Phillips teams being the best overall era of Houston football in terms of fan reception, making it to 2 AFC Championship games in that time span with 3 10-win seasons. Players were brought to tears at this admiration, and it would forge a permanent bond between them and the city. The game of Bum Phillips was also unique among the NFL. He treated his players like family, trying to get his entire team to know each other, even letting them bring their families to practice and play with them. It was like living in a small Texas town, where everyone knew everybody. And it was that atmosphere that he promoted that helped his team stand strong together and bring the franchise its first great spark of hope of life in nearly 2 decades. And there would be unbridled hope that this team could get to the Super Bowl one day. And Bum sure did try to make through on that promise.
1 year ago, we knocked on the door. This year, we beat on the door. Next year, we're going to kick the son of a in.
It was a rare moment.
But just like at the start of the 1970s, Houston would fail to make the playoffs for the majority of the 1980s. Bum Phillips, for reasons very contrived, was fired in 1980 after losing to the Raiders in the playoffs after an 11-5 season, and would start a near sudden decline to irrelevance under new head coach Ed Biles. But Bum after this would join the New Orleans Saints as head coach, who were owned by another Texas oil magnate, and it is where he and ultimately Earl Campbell would end their NFL careers. The Oilers sorely missed Bum, and it was very clear. After a disappointing 1981 season that had them going 7-9, the 1982 season that was compounded by a player strike that forced 7 games off the schedule, Houston left with their worst record in franchise history at 1-8. They went from Super Bowl contender to factory of sadness in 2 seasons flat, and went 2-14 the next year as Biles would leave mid-season due to the team's abysmal performance. Weird logic from Bud there. You fire your best coach that brought you to the playoffs and hasn't had a record under 10 wins since 1978, but keep the guy who led your franchise into the gutter nearly 2 straight years. Great job. Though just as in the 70s, pieces would eventually fall their way to get them back to the postseason. But there would be one prime piece out there, and not just any piece. A true franchise quarterback. Warren Moon.
I'm a Houston all. I'm a Houston all. I'm a Houston all. I'm a Houston all. I'm from H-Town and I love to drink that all. I'm a Houston all. I'm a Houston all. I'm from H-Town and I love to drink that all. I'm a Houston all.
One of the greatest CFL quarterbacks ever would become an Oiler in the 1984 season after Bud Adams won a bidding war to bring his talent to the organization, as well as getting USFL running back Mike Rozier to become a key cog in the offense. While the season was still awful at 2-14 under Hugh Campbell, who Moon actually worked with in the CFL, Moon would throw for a franchise record 3,338 yards that season. Earl Campbell would also leave the team before the end of the year to go to the Saints with Bum, where he'd spend the last 2 years of his career before retiring. That's a sad waste of Texan talent. The Oilers improved though, and going 5-11 the next 2 years under Jerry Glanville. During another strike-ridden season in 1987, this time they would take advantage and snuck into the playoffs with a 9-6 record, getting a winning record and berth for the first time in 7 years. They beat the Seahawks in overtime in the wild card before eventually bowing out to Denver in the divisional round in the 1988 playoffs. They made the playoffs in each of the last few years of Glanville's tenure, In 1988, they went 10-6 as they beat Cleveland in the wild card round but lost to Buffalo the next week. In 1989, they went 9-7 to once again lose to Pittsburgh in the wild card. While they were finally getting back to consistent playoff appearances and performances, things weren't going good for the Oilers in the city of Houston. The Oilers were getting their act together just as they were on the cusp of getting potentially Art Modell before Art Modell even considered moving the Browns to Baltimore. The Houston area, it seems, may not be home to an NFL franchise much longer. While the Astrodome was still a revered stadium and legendary building to many Texans, it just wasn't the most modern. In 1987, it was the lowest capacity stadium of the league at just 50,000. Bud wanted renovations, and he wanted them now. He even threatened to move the team to Duval County if he didn't get them. Duval. While Harris County, who is the county that Houston resides in, would eventually cave and give the Dome 10,000 extra seats and 65 luxury boxes in the renovations made at Adams' request, these were all funded by taxpayer money. But Adams did not contribute any of his money to the plans, and this would it would continue to make more and more demands for accommodations, which would ultimately lead to the downfall and death of football in Houston. At this point also, the fan base was going adversarial with Adams, as his continued tampering the team, such as firing Bud Adams and trading away Earl Campbell, and demands for more and more taxpayer money for accommodations did not sit well with them, especially in 1987 when the Oilers were barely just starting to get back into form. Many fans were skeptical about the team's future, but over time, they would get back to loving the team thanks to Moon and others, and helping to reshape the AFC. The team now was hitting its stride, making the playoffs 7 years in a row from 1987 to 1993. Under new GM Mike Holovac and head coach Jack Pardee, who was a Houston legend, they won their first AFC Central Division title in 1991 with an 11-5 record. The first time accomplishing such a feat since their days in the AFL. They beat the Jets 17-10 in the wildcard round, only to be scolded by John Elway and the Broncos in a heartbreaking 26-24 loss on a Broncos field goal. In 92, they would go 10-6 and played against the Buffalo Bills in the wildcard. They were dominant in that game, going up 35-3 in the middle of the third quarter. This showed just how much talent and tenacity was on the Oilers' side. But like in the rest of Houston's history, they collapsed. How bad did they collapse? They allowed 28 points in the third quarter and went on to lose in overtime 41-38 in a game known as the comeback. The biggest come from behind victory in the NFL history, and the biggest choke in the history of football. Houston became an embarrassment with the choke, and Bud Adams was ready to pull the plug, threatening that if they didn't shape up and win a Super Bowl, he was going to blow it all up. And considering the 1994 season would be the first one with the salary cap implemented, the future was not looking bright as the players realized that this would probably be their last best chance to bring Houston a Super Bowl. So how did Houston respond? By playing up to the challenge. They went on a franchise-best 12-4 to win the AFC Central once again, and even getting something they hadn't had before in the NFL. A first-round bye, with the longest winning streak in the NFL since the 1972 Dolphins. This would be the first time that they would have the rest advantage they needed to punch their ticket to a Super Bowl. The run-and-shoot offense held by Kevin Gilbride and blitzing 46 defense from Buddy Ryan worked to terrorize and scold the opposition of the league. Warren Moon skied the ball. The 46 defense didn't let the opposing opponent score more than 20 points on them after week 12, and the city of Houston was as excited as they had been since the Luv Ya Blue era. And a win in the divisional round would set up a grudge match against the Bills in the AFC Championship game at Rich Stadium to potentially avenge the choke. But then Marty Schottenheimer's Chiefs came in and beat the Oilers at home 28-20, scoring 21 points in the fourth quarter to shock the world. And with that, the Oilers' fate was sealed. The season, while being their best in terms of regular season success, was fraught with drama. Along with the intense pressure, so many other factors led to the team's collapse against the Chiefs. Several players were involved in brawls with each other in the preseason. The coaching staff wasn't on the same page, as Buddy Ryan was brought in and was not consulting with anyone on the offense. There was a potential QB controversy afoot as Cody Carlson was brought in with a big contract for backup at the time. They started off the season only winning 1 game out of 5, with Moon being benched a few times and not even starting against the game that started their 11-game win streak in the Patriots. While they did win out, their offensive and defensive coordinators in Gilbride and Ryan respectively were at each other's throats during the year, and they even got into a short brawl in the televised game against the Jets in Week 17. Each one of them saw each other as sabotaging the team's efforts. Ryan would always constantly criticize the publicly, and in private, the run-and-shoot offense, as the chuck and duck. He would regularly blitz the offense in practice and ignore plays, leading to several fights as many feared what would happen if they were injured. Gilbride's offense, while great and revolutionary for its time, was something that got the team in a lot of turnover trouble and quick 3-and-outs, and it was an aggressive and risky scheme that would lead to a tired defense to go back on the field. This conflict would never be solved. Babygate also happened. Offensive tackle David Williams did not play in the game against the Patriots that started the win streak due to his wife having his first son, wanting to be there for the birth. His wife also had a previous miscarriage, so you can see why he put his personal life before the team. He was fined a game check, over $100,000 by the Oilers, and was criticized by Adams himself for misplacing priorities. Eventually the fine was dropped, but that's a pretty bad look. On a more tragic note, Jeff Alm, a defensive lineman who was gearing to come back from IR after breaking his leg earlier in the year, died. While hanging out with his best friend Sean Lynch, he was driving while intoxicated. He crashed his car on a guardrail, and Lynch was not wearing his seatbelt, flying out of the car to his death on the 610 and Highway 59 interchange. Alm in a panic called 911, but there was nothing he could do. He would then take a shotgun out of the trunk of his car, fire 3 shots in the air, then turn the gun on himself and committed suicide. While this unified the players on offense and defense to play in honor of Jeff, this did little for the coaching staff aside from party. And as well as 2 players were openly gay on the team, and while thankfully it was never found out until afterwards, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, it was a bad news story waiting to happen. The 1993 Houston Oilers are remembered as one of the most talented squads in NFL history, having one of, if not the most turbulent seasons as well. Seeing enough, Bud Adams would go through with his promise. He gutted the team with their star quarterback and Moon by shipping him to the Vikings. Houston vets would either leave in free agency, be traded, or retire. Buddy Ryan would go to Arizona the first chance he got, and the Oilers would go deep into the tank with a 2-14 record that year under Party, who would be fired before the end of the year to be replaced by the last ever coach of the Oilers and longtime coach of the Titans, Jeff Fisher. Gilbride would be fired as well, and the Oilers would never be this successful again while in Houston. While the Oilers were stuck in the mud of another rebuild, Adams was back to his shenanigans with the city of Houston, this time wanting a brand new stadium altogether that could be used to share with the Rockets in a configuration similar to the Alamo Dome that was used by the San Antonio Spurs, and even in a potential NHL team. Why share with the basketball team and not the Astros like they were already doing? I don't know. He didn't even consult the other owners about this, as the Rockets owner would not like the idea of sharing amenities with Adams and team facilities and would balk at the move the first chance he got. But at least this time Adams would front 25% of the bill. All he had to get through was the Houston populace, who were absolutely fucking furious at him for trading Moon. How do you think that went? Houston Mayor Bob Lanier initially supported Adams, but did not say so publicly. And Houston taxpayers that were already pissed at him for the renovations to the Astrodome and the destruction of the Oilers' core weren't extremely keen to throw more of their hard-earned money towards even more renovations so soon after the other ones, especially since they were still paying for most of the bill. Houston at the time was also struggling to get over the oil collapse of the 80s. And, oil is a big deal to the Texas economy and the Houston area. The budget was already strained enough as it was. Seeing no choice, though, just like Art Modell would do with the Browns not long after, at the end of the 1995 season that had the Oilers going to -7-9, Adams announced that the Oilers would be doing the reverse of Sam Houston and taking the Oilers to Nashville, Tennessee. And the fans in Houston just stopped giving a fuck. Who can blame them? This was the second best stretch in Houston football's history in the NFL. You had a prime quarterback talent. You had a great defense, amazing offense, great coaching. And he ripped it away from him. He ripped it away. He was killed by him. All because he couldn't get a shiny new toy to call his own. He was going to take the team away to Tennessee, to another state. If you were a fan of the team at that time, how would you feel? Betrayed? Pissed off? The fans that stuck with this team through all the losing since the merger, all the meddling, and supported it through thick and thin, even setting multiple attendance records at the time in the Astrodome in the 93 season, only for their support to get a gigantic double middle finger in return from the guy who founded the team in the first place. This was a disgusting display of an owner who did not give a shit about goodwill towards the team and the city that he played in. And if you've been paying attention to any of the recent teams move cities in a similar manner, you have people like Bud Adams to thank for allowing this to be precedent among owners whenever they wouldn't get their way with the cities they called home. At least Art Modell actually was kind of sad about it when he moved the Browns. He didn't want to, it seemed. He still butt-fucked the Browns, but you can at least go, oh, at least he was kind of, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to. Adams was like, fuck you guys, I'm out, bitch. Here's this double middle finger. This is a black eye among the NFL that will always be remaining. It will never go away. And so the 1996 season would be the last that Houston would ever be an Oilers. While they went 8-8, they would win most of their games on the road. The attendance for their home games was appalling, with only three of their 8 games going over 30,000 in attendance. And even mimicking the LA Chargers by playing 16 road games is what Houston fans would willingly show up unless they were diehards. As well as not even having their games televised, as the NFL at the time only televised games with sellout crowds, so it was on local blackout. You could hear conversations on the goddamn sideline. It was so quiet in the stands. Their own radio network was even leaving games early to see how the Rockets were doing. No, to see the pregame of the Rockets' preseason games. And the team's last home game in Houston was a 21-13 loss to the Bungles, with only 15,000 people showing up to watch. That's embarrassing. After the game, Adams was unwilling to lose more and more money with his venture, and would buy himself out of the Oilers' lease to go to Tennessee, and play in some college stadiums in the meantime while his new stadium was being built. And with that, would be the last time Houston would be home for an NFL franchise in the millennium. While several people would try to get an expansion franchise established before 2000, no one could get one. Then one last gut punch was given to the Oilers fan base. The team name and logo would never be used again, as Adams would retain all records and heritage from his time in Houston, meaning no matter if the Houston area got a team back, they would never be the Oilers ever again, and all of the great players in Oiler history would never be associated with the city that they played in. Adams renamed the Oilers to the Titans in 1998, and that was what led to the death of football in Houston. Though karma is also not biased in these situations, and made moving to Nashville a living hell for Adams as he was dealing with the same problems he was dealing with in 1996, but worse. Playing in 2 different stadiums, one in Memphis and one near Nashville, and also having a fucking tornado hit the ground of his stadium. Also, thank you Yinzers for embarrassing Adams. But for Houston, something worse would come up in that 1999 season. A Super Bowl run by the Titans. If the city of Houston was bearing a grudge against Adams for the move, they would have hated his guts more than Browns fans did with Modell, who would win a Super Bowl in 2000 with the Ravens, but at that time the Browns did come back by way of expansion already, so that mellowed the pain. But Houston didn't have one yet. So if Adams won a Super Bowl so quickly after that move, Houstonians would be not only dead inside, they would be willingly showing up at his Houston home to fucking get his ass. And in 1999, the Titans nearly did just that. With the new stadium, the Titans, under former Oilers number 3 overall pick in the first round, Steve McNair at QB, and Eddie George, they went 13-3, didn't lose at home, beat the Bills in their last playoff appearance for the long time with the Music City Miracle, and would beat the Colts and then the Jaguars, both division rivals, and with the Jaguars, but the best team in the NFL with a 14-2 record, to go to the Super Bowl to play against the greatest show on turf in the St. Louis Rams, who had also moved cities in the Super Bowl that year. But the bad luck that the Oilers had came with Adams, as they came up just 1 yard short to Kurt Warner and the Rams. The Titans have not ever again come as close to a Super Bowl title as 1999, and the remaining time with Jeff Fisher was filled with high hopes and awful embarrassments. I do not blame the team, but I do blame Bud Adams. This was just like when Dean Spanos fucked over San Diego to go to LA, and the Titans have been cursed ever since by that move, with their only time coming close to a Super Bowl since that game being their appearance in the 2019 AFC Championship game and getting beaten soundly by the Chiefs. But in that 1999 season, despite that scare, the city of Houston did have hope that they would get a new franchise, and that is exactly what happened.
The entire Houston community, and above all, the fans of the Houston Texans, for bringing NFL football back to this great city tonight.
Cowboys come with 4. Carr with time. Complete down to the 5. Diving for the end zone. Touchdown, Billy Miller. Are you kidding me? Second and 7 for the Texans. Carr. Bradford. Touchdown. Like real estate, location, location, location. Carter under pressure, they got it, it's a safety.
That ought to do it.
Seth Payne and Gary Walker. Hats off to that defense. The final score, the Texans win their opener, 19-10 over Dallas.